So thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to our fourth episode in the Community Connected series, a series of conversations, insights and webinars that we have been offering in the Foundervine community to help our community better navigate COVID-19 and continue to explore new opportunities to grow businesses. This is a particularly important conversation for us, and we've been really excited to see the level of response and enthusiasm that we've had for this really important topic. I'm going to shortly be introducing our panel, who are all interesting and distinguished people within their own respective fields. But before I do, I'll tell you a bit more about Foundervine, why we exist, and do a bit of housekeeping as well. So I am Izzy Obeng, and I'm the Managing Director of Foundervine. Foundervine was set up in 2017 to respond to the challenges we saw in a startup community that wasn't as inclusive as it could be, and didn't offer founders from diverse backgrounds the same level of opportunity to grow businesses, access networks, and raise the kind of funding that they needed in order to grow sustainable businesses. So we have been running training programs for 3 years now. We've had 66 ventures form on our programs to date. Our founders have gone on to raise funding, and we have been really interested and sort of supportive of building out a more inclusive ecosystem, whether that is increasing access to research and the kind of support within the education system that young people need in order to understand enterprise and start new ventures. Recent events have affected us all in various ways. Within the Black community in particular, there's been a lot of conversation recently about what happens next after Black Lives Matter. What do we do as a community to build capacity and to increase the amount of opportunity available to young people in order to kind of grow the economy that we need for the future? So we have brought together a range of people across different sectors, from civil society, from the political sphere, and from business, to have an honest conversation about what happens next in the future of the Black economy. As a community, we have been really troubled by the persecution of Black people, both abroad and at home in the UK, and COVID-19 has impacted an economy that many already felt was disconnected from them and felt excluded from the growth that's taking place, particularly as we see in the digital tech ecosystem. What this conversation is about is exploring how we build a better Black economy, how we grow greater control over the infrastructure that supports the economy, as well as a mandate to support and grow Black businesses. We really want to explore what the responsibility is of the establishment. By that, we mean the institutions that govern us and drive our economy, including government policy that provides access to job opportunities, home ownership, education, and access to finance. So we brought a cross-section of our community together to have this conversation. Khalia Ismain is going to join very shortly. She's currently filming for the BBC, but for now, I will introduce our other panelists. So panelists, if I can ask you to unmute yourself, and we will start with Tom, if you'd like to introduce yourself to us.
Hi, my name's Tom Adeyoola. I'm a technology entrepreneur. For the last 12 years until last summer, I was running my own technology startup that I founded in retail. I sold and exited that in the summer to a big Hong Kong clothing manufacturer called TAL, and then subsequently I've been focused on positive society and climate-related projects. I currently sit on 4 boards and recently co-founded a research organisation called Extend Ventures, which is looking to democratize access to finance. So by that I mean we're going out there, we're about to kick off a big research project in looking at all businesses and identifying businesses by ethnicity. So we're going to take the businesses that exist out there, we're going to crawl the internet and establish and connect businesses to images, and then understand ethnicity to then enable us to understand the returns of ethnically diverse founders versus the average founder. It's mirroring a study which has been done in the US, which found that there was a 30% higher return to ethnically diverse founders over the average. And consequently, we want to use that information to push the government around trying to solve for structural biases and essentially change the narrative of investment in Black and ethnic minority businesses from being one of altruism to one of straightforward economic rationale. So there's an untapped opportunity here that needs to be filled. So consequently, last few weeks have been lobbying a lot. We pushed out an urgent survey around the impact on Black and ethnic minority businesses from COVID-19. We also sent out a letter to Rishi Sunak and the major banking institutions, which was covered in the Times on Monday. And we've now finally got our first responses. So we've got meetings on the way with the British Business Bank, HSBC, and others to come. So that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. We'll go to Patricia next. There you are.
We're playing mute and unmute, aren't we? Hello, everybody. And hello, panelists. Hello, all the... oh, was that you? Hello?
We can hear you, Patricia.
Oh, okay. So thank you to everybody who's listening in. And I found that the Q&A and all that survey absolutely fascinating. So I'm really glad to be speaking. My name is Patricia Lamour. I'm the CEO of Aspire Education Group, which is a global and local consultancy and independent learning provider. I'm also a co-founder of Black Socks, which is an asset-based community development network, which has national and international connections, particularly in East Africa. And we're currently running a historical national survey to ensure that the Black community, particularly parents, carers, educators, and all those specialist support staff who help children in schools, that they inform what the new normal needs to look like post COVID. Absolutely happy to be here. We also coordinate several Erasmus Plus projects, and one of them is about financial and economic literacy, particularly for migrant women, so Black, minority ethnic women's inclusion in business, because in the same way that we have the race gap in terms of business funding, we also have the gender gap. And so I'm really interested to speak and hear what the other panelists have to say and answer the questions here so that we can really get some movement, because now is really the time to be bold. As I said to my children when we have our weekly meetings, you know, we've had the knees on our neck for a long time, not only police brutality in every sector. And this is a time now that we need to come together and put the pressure back to get what we deserve.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patricia. We'll hand over to Nims next.
Hi, everybody. Great to be on this platform with Foundervine, and really loved, like Patricia said, loved the quiz, loved the responses. And yeah, looking forward to the debate we're about to have, or the discussion. I'm the chief executive of an organization called the Peace Alliance. I also happen to be the pastor of a local church called Freedom's Ark. I run projects across communities. I run a community food hub dealing with over 1,000+ individuals across Haringey and 17 boroughs in London, both with a food bank and the food hub, especially as a result of COVID. I am the chief financial officer for a new app that's about to be launched called the Excel app, or the Excel app, and it's a banking app that works with charities and church organizations. We're assuming that one day we might become black monster of this ecosystem, but we'll see where that goes. For my sins, I was running as an independent mayoral candidate for London. I stepped aside from being a deputy lieutenant for Her Majesty for that period, and we'll see where that goes. We've got to wait till 2021, May 6th, and decide whether I'll be on the bill to run as mayor.
Perfect, thank you, Nims. We'll go to Paul next.
Thanks, Izzy. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, and certainly a fantastic panel you put together, so it's going to be interesting. My name's Paul Cleal. These days, I'm a non-exec director and advisor. Most of my non-exec work is in the public sector at the moment. I'm with Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust, so interesting times, obviously, with the response to the pandemic. Also with Kingston University, where I'm deputy chair, where we got a big interest in entrepreneurship. On the advisory side, in the private sector, then my main two organisations I've been with for a couple of years now are the Premier League and World of Football, where I do some work on diversity and inclusion, and also Sainsbury's, the big supermarket chain. Prior to that, though, until about 3 years ago, for 16 years, I was a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. Saw that somebody, at least one person's on tonight from there, so hello to you. You might even remember me. I was a corporate finance partner originally. I've been on the board of PwC in the UK and also in Africa when I was based out in Lagos. My family originally from Cameroon. I was born here in London, as you can tell by my accent. So got a wide range of interests, and one of the main reasons why I'm interested in the work that Foundervine does is through being a founder investor in Impact X Capital, which some of you may have heard of, which seeks to bring much needed capital to black-led businesses in the UK and Europe. So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, all of you, for those introductions. So we'll kick off the conversation. I have lost count of the number of conversations I've had over the last few weeks around racism and economic inequality in the UK. And the question that I keep asking myself is this going to be the moment that Britain changes? And I think it's really important for all of us to ask each other how we're feeling at the moment and how it's going in light of recent events. So that's my first question to all of you. How have you been feeling? Patricia, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Well, sad. I lost my mother 2 months ago. And I've known 3 other people who lost people to COVID-19, one of our young people, and we run Aspire Prep boot camps as well, teaching children, and one of his father we just lost on Saturday. So the impact and risk of COVID-19 on the Black population is very real, very real. At the same time, I've been very reflective, and I do think the change is in the air. Through Black Sox, we're actually linked to George Floyd's lawyers. So we believe that we're going to make an impact. And I think, as I said, I've been around a long, long time, 30, 40 years fighting this fight. And I still remain very hopeful. And I think, given from what I've been seeing around the global protests, I am very hopeful. And I think there's a greater sense of community. I think if George Floyd's death had happened when everybody was busy and going about their lives, I don't think it would have had the same impact it has. But I think the pandemic has made us all pause and reflect. There should be no going back to business as normal. So I'm very, very hopeful for transformation and change.
Thank you, Patricia. And it'd be great to hear from some of our other panelists. How are you feeling at the moment? Tom, you've been on my newsfeed quite a lot at the moment, talking about the challenges that diverse founders face in terms of access to funding. How have you been feeling about everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of going into the COVID-19 crisis, I felt spent that time being actually very angry because I could see the impending just incompetence and what was going to happen. So the canary in the coal mine, if you like, was some of my ex-employees who were talking about the numbers, the stats guys, and then seeing the basically incompetent and lazy nature of how the government was responding. And I felt so those early days of lockdown felt very disempowering. So you're stuck at home. How can you basically get involved? How can you do anything, right? So, and I think it's taken a while for us to all learn or relearn how we can engage with each other and meet with each other and sort of try and coalesce groups. So I think certainly as the impact was starting to become clear, we'd started a long-term project, but it felt like there was definite need to do something in the here and the now. And how could we sort of bring groups together? And I think the sense of everybody being at home actually, and everybody having to use Zoom, was a means by which some of the barriers were broken down to be able to sort of reach out to different groups, connect them, bring them in, start to build bridges and sort of talk about having one voice. And I think from a macro level, I think when I look at sort of protest movements now compared to just 10 years ago, if you think of protest movements like Occupy, which didn't really have any impact, and you think now about Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, and Black Lives Matter, there's been a huge amount of learning on how to basically focus and have a clear agenda and have a clear route to action. And also, I don't think it's any coincidence that in a post-Trump and Brexit world, the sort of middle classes who'd sort of outsourced change to government had started to realize that, we need to fight for what's right and fight for what's important. So I think all of the sort of the tinderbox was there for this event to have a big impact. And, George Floyd ignited that in the sense of it was an unequivocal event. It was not something that could be downplayed in any other sort of typical manner where it's like, oh, he's running away, etc. It was just so clear and obvious. And I think that's the thing which then brought the whole agenda into play. And I think, as you sort of said, it's been quite exhausting since, in terms of having a lot of those conversations which people wouldn't have or weren't ready or willing to have before. They're now having those conversations. A lot of my white friends thinking about things, talking about things which wouldn't have been on the agenda, being able to talk about race in a different way. So previously, if you talked about race, you end up in racism and it ends up being quite binary, whereas actually being able to talk about lots of the layers all the way through and talk about lived experiences. And I found that quite fascinating and empowering. And as a consequence of looking at access to finance, that's been pushed up the agenda. But I'm not complacent about whether the government really cares and is going to make real action, because I think actually this government is thinking about settlement for Brexit regions before it's going to look at any sort of settlement for Black and ethnic minorities. And I think that it's going to be taking the energy of this forward over the long term, which is going to be hard. But at the same time, this week I've been on a working group for my former school looking at decolonizing the educational curriculum, and I've found that actually pretty inspiring. So it comes at it from both ends. So the fact that pupils from my own school are seemingly way more woke than our generation, looking at the context of how history is taught, how English is taught, and how diversity and inclusion could be brought into every area of the curriculum from that level and up, I think makes me optimistic of systemic long-term change.
Thank you, Tom. Definitely lots of areas covered there, and I hope we get to touch on all of them a bit more during the conversation, and the nuances of talking about race and decolonising our curriculums and kind of how we move forward together as a consciousness. We've just been joined by Khalia, who's just joined us from some recording for the BBC. Khalia, it'd be great if you could introduce us, introduce Jamii, and tell us a bit about how you're feeling at the moment.
Thank you so much, and I apologise to everyone for my late arrival. Unfortunately, it was outside of my control, but thank you so much for welcoming me. So I'm Khalia. I'm the founder of Jamii, which is a discount card and marketplace for Black-owned businesses in the UK. How I've been feeling over the last couple of weeks, it's been an interesting one. I think when everything kicked off, the first reaction of a lot of people was to start searching and shopping for Black-owned businesses, which meant that from a Jamii perspective, it basically created a huge level of demand. Our partners literally started selling out over a couple of days. Like there was one partner who had nothing left to sell, like everything that she had gone, which was incredible. And that was kind of a very similar tale for a lot of Black-owned businesses, which was amazing because I think from a personal perspective, it diverted my energy from everything that was going on in the world and everything that was causing it to something which was a lot more positive. But kind of fast forward to where we are now, a few weeks, I think that energy still exists. It's obviously tapering off as it naturally would, but I think now my focus and the focus of the kind of people in our ecosystem is like, how can we, like, clearly there is money for Black-owned businesses. How can we kind of continue to ensure that it comes into the community and that it circulates within the community? But also all the bigger corporations and everyone who's being held to account a few weeks ago, how can we ensure that continues on long term and it's not just a social media post, and it goes beyond that, and then in a few months' time we kind of are seeing a more concerted shift in attitudes towards Black founders, towards Black businesses generally. And so I'm kind of, yeah, I'm optimistic. I think, leveling it all out, I am optimistic, but I'm also realistic that a lot of it was driven by social media pressures and by, marketing teams not wanting their companies to be the ones who weren't making statements and stuff like that. So yeah.
Brilliant. So we'll move on to the next question now. I think we've got quite a limited amount of time to cover quite a meaty topic. And what we really want to do with this conversation is start at the macro level and discuss the challenges that the current government face in terms of addressing some of the issues we're talking about, and then talk through access to opportunity with regard to education, employment, and access to capital for founders. So the first sort of question I have for the panel is 3 years after the government's race disparity audit sought to tackle the burning injustices in our society. You may remember this from Theresa May's government. And around the same time, Baroness McGregor-Smith's review was released, highlighting the blatant discrimination in the labour market for people from BME backgrounds. There has been report after report, and I think maybe some of us are quite fatigued by the reports and are looking at what action is going to be taken. So I'll direct this question to Nims initially. What are the main challenges that the current government face in tackling discrimination? I'm just unmuting you, can't hear you, Nims.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks a lot. I was having a chat with a government advisor to, well, the Prime Minister's advisor, funny enough, today. And we were speaking about some of the challenges. And one of the things he wanted to make clear, even for this conversation, was that the Prime Minister was listening and the advisors were listening, and that they were taking on a constructive positioning around the Windrush cross-government working group had. Presently, I know that is a big concern. I think they've just appointed Bishop Webley to chair the Windrush cross-government working group in order to deal with that. And I think they've accepted to implement all the recommendations of the Wendy Williams review today. So that is a present position they've just accepted. That said, there was a recognition and understanding that the government has to inject much more money into Black businesses. And they were keen for us to know and make reference to the bounce back loans of the 750 million worth of charity grants. Now, whether that actually activates what we need within the Black community is subjective, but I think that government were keen that we understood, especially for this conversation, that they want to focus on supporting local entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, however, we've been here before. We've been here, we've heard series of commitments, we've had many conversations where the government says it's time to act and it's time to hold public services to account, it's time to hold the private sector to account. But my concerns around what Boris's government is able to do is see whether they're able to address the issues around systemic racism. I remember 20 years ago when I started the Peace Lines and I was speaking with a lot of civil servants, all heads of, senior managers within civil service. There was only one Black man in that room, and that Black man was me. Now, fast forward to where we are with the civil service. I was thinking about this, and you find that you have 87.3% all white within the civil service in the United Kingdom. You have only 3.4% Black civil servants. Now, if we have only 3.4% Black people within the civil service, we find that there is already a challenge that this government has to respond to. And how do we fast track and get more Black people within the civil service? How do we ensure with tribunal judges, where you have 88.9% of tribunal judges who are white and only 11% from the BAME community? These are certain concerns I think that Boris will need to address. We talk about the opportunities that might exist for us as Black, as the Black community, but I used to chair the London Criminal Justice Board Advisory Group, so I was overseeing criminal justice. I know I didn't say that in my initial conversation. And when we have a police service that has 93% white folks, and unfortunately we have an overrepresentation of Black people who are being arrested, Black people who are in prisons, Black people whose futures are being taken away from them, then the future of the Black man is not exactly as hopeful as I feel. You know, if you were going to ask me how I felt, I would say I feel challenged but hopeful. Challenged because I still know that we've not yet been able to address some of the core issues that need to be addressed. I'm excited about Black founders. I'm excited about Black entrepreneurial opportunities, but yet I am consciously aware that we've not yet gone into the educational issues that are underachievement within the schools. We've not dealt with the issues that this government has to deal with in relation to underemployment, under promotions. We don't find Black people being promoted to the highest levels within any sphere of public service or private service. So or in the private sector. So I actually think that there is a need to legislate some of the things we need to see happen. We can't just put a token Black person into a position and assume that's resolved the issue. George Floyd's death is significant, but we've got to take advantage of this moment. And this is whether we can, as Black people, consider ourselves, even though we're not necessarily a homogeneous community, we can look at some of the pains and challenges of our experience and come together and fight and hold this government to account.
Thank you, Nims. And Patricia, I know Nims mentioned underachievement in schools, and you're doing a huge piece of research at the moment about the impacts of COVID-19 on minority communities and access to support for young people. Did you want to come in terms of how the government could better tackle discrimination? You're muted.
I think one of the key things is terminology. Let's get rid of BAME. BAME is lame, yeah? Forget that one. Also, this notion of being a minority. Black people are the global majority. Africa's population is destined to overtake the world in terms of people looking like young Black people who are listening to this, this webinar. are going to be the global majority. And in terms of London, Birmingham, Manchester, if you look at schools, the ethnic minority are in fact the ethnic majority. The DFE statistics actually show that 1/3 of all schools nationally, you know, from Cornwall to wherever, of minority ethnic is 1/3, 1/3. Okay, so the demographics have changed, but the leadership, the civil service, the military, the journalists, the governors, the top FTSE 100 haven't. That's the problem. Yeah, and until, you know, people were talking about as if you couldn't even mention race, people getting uncomfortable, but it's here. It's been here a long time, and we need to tackle it systemically. And all the statistics that Nims was talking about, the overrepresentation, the school exclusion rate, school exclusions, they have been excluding Black children for 50 years. It hasn't stopped, and it's getting younger. They're excluding more children in primary school. Yeah? So if Black children are being seen as a problem, they're being pushed out. And they're joining this pipeline, which people are saying is the school to prison pipeline. And then they're turning around and being over-policed on the streets in terms of whether they're joining gangs or being stopped and searched and everything. This is this feeling of young people with their backs against the walls. So I'm really hopeful that education has to be key. One of the major problems this government has, they've had nearly 6 education secretaries in the last 5-6 years. Any school which had a turnover that would have been shut down. Come on. You know, so in terms of the leadership is lacking. They cannot, you know, how can you deal with a problem that you're not even dealing with yourself? You're not an example of it. The person that they want to lead this new race equality, whatever it is, there's a petition going around to say that she shouldn't even be there. So that shows there's a lack of credibility. There's a lack of credibility in the current government's stance around race equality. We don't think they can do it. So that means we have to, they've been talking about holding their feet to the fire. Anyhow, they've been holding their feet to the fire. The whole of their limbs should have been burnt off by now in terms of the lack of action that's actually, you know, hasn't happened. So that means all of us, whether it's in terms of Black businesses, whether it's in terms of Black educators, whether it's in terms of Black researchers, we have to now really demand what we want. We know what the issues are, but we have to gather the data and analyze it for ourselves and leverage for what we want and what we need. So for instance, let's take these bounce back loans, this COVID-19. If UK is anything like America, we're not going to get it. We're not going to get the proportion that we deserve. That's what America's already shown. So that means we've got to find ways of coming together, whether that means Black chambers of commerce or whatever it means, to recognize our worth to the economy and to see that if we start to invest in ourselves, in our education and supporting each other, we can make it. We do not need charity. We should not have to need charity. If we're producing quality products and services, and you know, these are being bought and up to the quality standards of everybody else, we don't need the charity. We just need the level playing field, and education is not ensuring that. And the way that you know, banks and other hoops and hurdles that people have to jump into are not ensuring that. So for instance, one of the key things is contracts compliance. And I'm glad that that survey said that one of the second things after the Black directorship survey, Black directorship targets must be about Black businesses in the supply chain. Because if you're not in the supply chain, forget about the COVID money, which remember is public money being given back to us. It's not some, you know, something that's dropped from trees. It is a public money that's been returned to the public. But when we talk about the supply chain, if you look what the government usually procures, local authority and central government, if Black businesses are not even on those chains, how are we supposed to get sustainable business post-COVID? And one last thing I want to let you know. I was speaking with one of our parents who is an educational paediatrician for Croydon. When she went back into her office and she looked down in Croydon in the high street, the line for the cash converters was going around the block. that is a poverty that is beginning to hit our community. And those are the people who have something to convert into cash. What about those who haven't? And there's something that's just come out of the Telegraph in terms of how COVID is, really worsening the wealth gap that is in this country. They're talking about for every £238,000 of wealth that white people have in this country, Black African have less than a tenth of that, 8%. So, let us make no mistake, coming out of COVID, this is going to be so tough. We're not going to just be able to bounce back, like a bounce back loan. We have to really come together and find out how we can educate ourselves to invest in each other and support one another.
Thank you, Patricia. And we'll definitely talk through some of the challenges around financial infrastructures and support for Black businesses. And I want to bring us back to the education piece, because it's been in the news a lot now. And for years and years, we've seen students across the country campaign to make our universities more inclusive and increase opportunities for young people from our backgrounds. And to give a bit of context for this, so BAME individuals represent 22.3% of undergraduate students in the UK, but only 10% of entry-level employees within 6 months of graduation, and 5% of senior-level positions. So we're seeing inequality compound as individuals advance. And so a question for the panel: what are the concrete solutions that we can use to bridge these gaps and mobilize Black talent? Can we go to Paul first on this one?
Thanks. Yeah, my perspective really, I guess, is informed by my time at PwC. I was, for a time when I was on the board there, in charge of all their recruitment, and I played a role in the diversity and inclusion initiatives over, I guess, the last 15 years or so before I left, and saw a few things change. The firm then did quite well. I mean, I'd say that the average number of people from a Black and ethnic minority background would have been in the 30%, so something like 35% of all graduates coming into the firm. But they were not evenly spread across the ethnicities. So the point that's already been made about the difference between Black and other minorities was well made. And certainly, if you look at what's happened in the big four professional services firms, then the differences start between the experience of Black people and other ethnic minorities. So there was a report in the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago, and I saw that of the 3,000 current Big Four partners, only 11 are from African heritage. And that was 6 at PwC and 5 at the others. And I think, we did quite well at PwC in terms relative to the others, but that's pretty poor overall, obviously. There are a lot more Asian partners now, especially Indian partners across all the firms. And some of that plays into stereotypes that are applied in the labour market to Indians in particular being very good technicians. So it's not surprising when you get those results. So I think firms have to realise that they have these often unintended or unconscious barriers. There are things that individuals can do themselves, but I think what I see, and I'm also, as I mentioned, involved in higher education at Kingston University, the problems seem to me to start to some extent in schools, yes, but there are bigger problems, I think, in higher education. I think it's a very complacent sector that isn't doing much. Black people are starting to fall behind and not get the degrees they should at that level. They're not getting access to the elite universities. And of course, a lot of the employers with the best jobs shop for people at the Russell Group and universities in particular, where probably 75% of the people are white and middle class. And it's so there's built-in bias just in where they look. So I think a lot of this comes down to what the firms do and the way in which they just structure themselves. A lot of it comes down to what goes on then in the firms when people arrive, which means that often results in individuals from Black backgrounds not advancing up the levels. So you've got a problem with recruitment, but you've got a probably even bigger problem, I would say, with retention and advancement within organisations, and that goes across the private sector. And in the public sector, I'd say, if anything, things are worse. In the civil service, I mean, some stats have been given tonight already about that, but I'd say it's pretty poor. And I think what you see across the board is a lack of any real intention about this. So if the question is what can be done differently to change outcomes for young black people going into business or public sector institutions, then the answer has to be, in the first place, that people have to try and really mean that they're going to do something different and be intentional about it. Someone asked me at a conference last year, what strategies had I seen that have not worked? And I said, well, the one I've seen very often used that doesn't work is just hope for the best strategy. And that's what often people think, just because we are growing as the number of people in primary schools and then secondary schools and then higher education, that sooner or later, yeah, the Prime Minister will be black, and maybe even the Queen as well, but I don't know, probably not. But we're not, but that doesn't happen over time. So people have to take a very intentional approach to what goes on within their organisations. And I think a lot of what needs to change is more about the organisations than it is about the black people going into them. Of course, there are always developmental needs, people with poorer networks and lower social capital because of their relative poverty of their upbringing. But I think organisations who have the opportunities need to look at themselves. And I think, and this is my reason for optimism, for the first time in my lifetime, really, I've heard senior white people, and in the jobs I'm involved with, I'm sort of talking to senior white people every day. And it's the first time in my lifetime I've heard white people at that level use terms like structural or institutional racism in the private sector, for example, to talk about systemic biases, to realise about their own privilege. And it really has not been discussed before. And I think that the big breakthrough of these last few weeks, which I agree with Patricia, is the conjunction not only of the George Floyd murder, but also COVID-19, disproportionate effects of that, and the time people have had to reflect on it, has meant that for the first time, people who need to make the difference in the senior middle-class white majority are starting to listen. And they've heard the protesters, but the opportunity for those of us who now have the ear of some of those people on a day-to-day basis is to take advantage of the door that's been opened by the protesters and try to push for further change. So I think it is an opportunity at this point. It's been created by some terrible events and the conjunction of those, but we now have the chance, which I don't think we've ever really seriously had before, to take advantage and really get genuine change now.
Putting a question for the chat, very briefly, are you able to summarise the kinds of initiatives that were taking place in PwC to increase the number of diverse hires? Sorry, that's back to you, Paul. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah, I just unmuted myself. Sorry. So there've been, I think, a lot over the years, and I think being conscious of the universities that people go to is the first thing. So, and not having strict rules. So some firms will only recruit from certain universities. That went out at PwC some time ago. And I think certainly going back 5 or 6 years, we were recruiting from more than 100 UK universities, so almost all of them. Another big change was in relation to A-level points, or UCAS points, where that was an additional filter applied to alongside university grades, and that tended to filter out people who'd been to poorer schools, who therefore got poorer A-level results. They were no longer relevant because people had degree results by then, but that was used as an additional filter. So what people have got to do, take those two examples of which universities you go to and whether you use A-level results, is think about what role those rules play in your system and start to eliminate the unintended consequences of those rules. And I think the firm has been pretty good at that, and that's why you get the pretty impressive, diverse range of recruits at the firm you see now. The issues, as I say, are now much more about advancement and retention of people and making sure that they get to the top. And that's a challenge that I know the firm and the other professional firms are still struggling with.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Paul. So a few of you have mentioned the importance of access to capital when it comes to diverse founders and the opportunities for that at the moment, particularly some of the government's recent announcements. I don't know if you've all seen today, but the diversity stats around the Future Fund have been published and definitely make for interesting reading. So following the government's announcement of the Future Fund, and for those of you who are kind of unaware, it's a support package for startups that have been affected by COVID-19. And concerns have been raised by the startup community around its failure to cater to diverse founders. So the question here is, what are the biggest challenges that Black businesses face in gaining access to capital? And we'll go to Khalia on that first.
So I'd say the first problem, and probably the biggest actually, is a lack of financial education and kind of actually understanding how different financial instruments work. Especially recently, I've seen a lot of people talking about investment, talking about venture capital, when actually their businesses and their business models don't make sense. It doesn't make sense to go down that route. And so people are kind of focusing on this method of raising funds, not realizing that actually, you know, you go down the venture capital route, the way that they make money is they kind of take a gamble on your business in the hope that you will be making 10x returns in, you know, 3 to 7 years, which usually will come about from you selling the business. And that's how they kind of pay for all of the gambles that they've been taking. And that doesn't make sense for a lot of businesses, especially the ones that I'm seeing Black founders going into, like the tech businesses. It works amazingly. For businesses who have huge range for scale, it works really well, not so much for other businesses. And I think that lack of understanding and not kind of understanding how other instruments work, like debt, like things like, I was talking to Lendo, who are small business lenders, and they were talking about how, for instance, taking bank loans and taking small loans, if you really understand your business, can work wonders. It can actually do so much more for you than getting an investor, but you have to understand how it works. And especially in our community, there's a huge kind of like, I'm trying to think of the right word, I'm losing the word, but there's like a huge kind of like aversion to even going down that route of taking on debt for your business. And I think that's causing people to kind of just go down the wrong routes and not necessarily know where to start. I think the second biggest thing that is causing that lack of access is literally just not knowing people. When it does come to investors and when it does come to these types of decisions, like they always get made by people who, when you know them, you're much more likely to receive the money. They're much more likely to want to give you the time of day, to give you the feedback on your pitch and on your business plan and stuff like that. And since most of the venture capital industry, the bank lenders, everyone, it's pretty pale, male and stale at the moment. It just means if you don't fit that demographic, you're less likely to know them, and they're also less likely to see themselves in you, which is like a huge problem. And so, I mean, I think I saw someone, I think in the chat, I think someone was mentioning that over the last few years, there's been a huge surge in investment firms, in capital that's being made available to underrepresented founders, to Black founders in particular. For instance, Lendo that I mentioned, who small business loans. We've got Cornerstone Partners. We've got Impact X, Extend Ventures. Like there's a really exciting number of investment arms coming out that are focusing on Black founders, which I think will start to change things. I think also as we start to talk about money as a community, as we start to talk about it more from the point of view of learning and making it more accessible, I do think things will change. But I think without us having that education, and I think without us kind of starting to make those connections early on in our entrepreneurial journeys, which hopefully will be made easier by these new organizations, I think we will continue to struggle to access finance and then make it work for us.
Brilliant, thank you, Khalia. And I'll go to Tom on this, but I'll loop in a question from our audience as well around this. And it's a question from Simi, and it's, do you think diversity in industry, which provides capital to founders such as PE and VC, would increase capital to Black founders? So as a young black person trying to enter the industry, it seems a barrier to entry to industry is quite high. So Tom, kind of looping my initial question, but also building in this question around the diversity within capital industry and financial industries as well, and how we actually increase the access to opportunity there.
Okay, so following on from what Khalia was saying, there are two types of businesses, one that is investor ready and one that isn't. So there's always this sense of like, which direction are you going to go in? Sorry, I've got a bit of hay fever and something in my eye. So I think, we have quite a nascent venture capital and PE industries, certainly for the lower end. And that has been the traditional white male and stale, and it's been sort of closed networks. You have to basically know somebody to get into those networks, and it's one of those things where it's don't call me, I'll call you. So I have to be introduced. It's warm introductions. And typically, therefore, if you're from a minority or you're from a different class, so I think it's important that to understand those two axes. Like in the UK, we have race, but we also have class. So if you have both, right, so you're working class and race, then you're even further down the spectrum in terms of being able to jump into other networks. And typically the networks that have money are from old established money. They're people who've been to the good schools and banks and so on and so forth. And it's really hard to break through into those groupings. And because we didn't have, certainly from a venture basis, we didn't have a successful internet boom period. We never gained any type of venture capital tier that had operational people who'd been there and done things and were all about making stuff happen. The venture tier that we ended up with was quite similar to PE, and it was all your typical bankers and financiers. They weren't doers, so they weren't connected to product, they weren't connected to operations, they weren't connected to getting things done. So consequently, that made that group even tighter, if you like, and more difficult to break into. When I started Metail back in 2008, the industry was really small and really difficult to get into. And I raised £25 million for my business. I didn't raise any from venture. And it all came from basically working really hard to network, working really hard to get into different groups of people. And most of that money in the end came from abroad, right? So it came from Hong Kong, where there are people sort of focused on what's the business do, how's it going to deliver value, and that was the key focus area. But I also recognized that I was fortunate enough to go to a great university and have a background which already pushed me into different networks. So I think the first starting point is then the networks point. And I think if you look at venture and you think about other areas of business where you might go after talent, let's say it's music or sport. If you're a football player and you're a great football player and you grew up in a favela in Brazil, you will be found. There are scouts that go out to find you. Like similarly, music, they'll go out to different areas to find opportunities. That just does not happen with money, right? So money is lazy. They don't do the scouting. They don't go out to find people. You have to break in. You have to prove your worth to break into them. So I think what the Black and ethnic minority community hasn't had is it hasn't had the successes that have been there and done it and then have come back to nurture and provide value back into the community and the next round of founders. And that's what you need to drive a virtuous circle. So when I look at the community today, it feels to me like the startup community was back in 2010. So it's 10 years behind. And sort of almost like the female founder is 5 like 5 years ahead of the Black and ethnic minority grouping. So it feels like there's great organizations that have emerged to sort of help founders get investor ready and get their pitches right and connect and network, the likes of Foundervine, YSYS. They're the beginnings of angel networks like Cornerstone Partners trying to help Black founded businesses. There's the beginning of diversity focused VC funds, all still early, and they all haven't yet got enough money. And And again, a lot of the LPs and the pension funds, the guys who have all the big money to put into these funds, they're all saying, well, come back when you've proved yourself, right? So we're not going to give you enough money yet to fund enough founders to be successful, which is then keeping that cohort down, right? So to get the virtuous circle, you need to have the successes, which brings in more money to make more successes, and so on and so forth. So that's where we at Extend are then focused on, right, we need to go and get the data to make the whole conversation unequivocal. So to go out to the pension funds and say, look, actually, because only the few get through currently, their returns on average, our hypothesis is going to be better than the norm. So if you were investing in this many more Black and ethnic minority founders, you would be returning better than the average. So it's an economic and business imperative to do this. It's nothing to do with altruism. It's an area that exists, and you should be trying to solve for market failure and structural biases. Like, force the community and force the finance community out into the markets. So when you look at things like the British Business Bank has ended up following the success of the initial cohorts and the unicorns and doing later stage deals, actually what it should be doing is then going back down again and basically reinvesting and helping nurture the next cohort, like the female founders. So I think off the back of the Rose Review, there's a £250 million fund, co-investment fund for female founders, which is due to come out at the end of the summer. Like, the same thing that needs to happen for, you know, the next cohort, Black and ethnic minority founders, and so on, right? To build everyone up and allow them to be successful. And similarly, when I look at things like bounce back loans were pushed through the banks for the other types of businesses, ignoring community development financial institutions and credit unions, which are the next layer down, which were there to serve underrepresented and the underserved communities, which is a model that we've basically taken in from the US. So now you've got banks who are giving money to businesses that they wouldn't otherwise give money to. So the moment the bounce back loan finishes, they'll say, see you later, sorry, we can't lend to you. And the CDFIs and the credit unions who would have lent to them don't have that money on their balance sheet. So now are basically not in a position to basically follow up and follow and lend. So there's an instability there, which unfortunately has been created by something which is virtuous on the face of it. So there's lots of these sort of structures and which need to be solved for and need attention. And I think the underlying problem is that the voices need to be in the room and decisions are made, and they're currently not in the room. Yeah,
I completely agree. I think it's really important to know, in the beginning, we were talking about progression of, Black people into director roles. Around 14% of the British population is BAME, yet there has never been a British-born FTSE chief executive from an ethnic minority. I'll leave that thought hanging in the air. As expected, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A at the moment, and I'm really keen for us to try and answer as many as possible. For those of you who won't have your questions answered tonight, please do feel free to contact us directly, and we'll be able to kind of signpost you to the relevant panelists if that's possible. So before we go into the Q&A, and I'll try and answer as many as I can, and I ask panelists to be as brief as you can so we can get through as many questions as possible. One last question to all the panelists, and that is, after 3 intense weeks of Black Lives Mattering, the news cycle is moving on a little. What do you hope happens next? So we'll start with Khalia.
So for me, the biggest thing that I'm focusing on is making sure that the energy from consumers remains constant. So over the last couple of weeks, I feel like consumers, buyers, individuals have really realized their economic power and the ability that they have to influence the decisions and the actions and the policies of the companies that they buy from. And so for me, what I really want to see is that people continue to remember the power that they have, just as people, because oftentimes people do feel powerless. They're not in, they're not in positions to really influence like huge amounts of change, but with your money, you can actually do a lot. And I just hope that people remember that, and they continue to hold all of the companies that posted their black squares on Blackout Tuesday, they continue to hold those businesses to account. So in a couple of months' time, they're returning and they're being like, so you said you were going to do this. Have you done it? Can we see? You said that you were going to devote X amount of shelf space to black brands, and you said you were going to invest X amount of money in building up diverse talent within your company. Like, let's see that now. We've given you time, and really kind of hold them to account with their money. And also, of course, just continuing to discover and support Black-owned businesses, because as we were just discussing, in terms of lack of access to capital, like there is a heavy dependence upon customer-funded growth, which is sales, and it is through supporting community brands that we will start to build up economic wealth.
Brilliant, thank you, Khalia. We'll go to Patricia next. You're on muted. You're muted at the moment. I'll just unmute you.
Mute me? Yeah. I said I was hoping you would come to me last, because I was sort of, when these kind of questions, I was sort of saying deeply, you know, what is the key thing? It has to be the children. The children are watching. Our young people are the future. These are our number one investments. When everyone's talking about balance sheets and bottom lines, it must be for the children. They should not be repeating the same kind of foolishness, madness. You know, they should not grow up to be racists or victims of racists. And that means we have to look about investing in education, and particularly the leadership of education, because there's a lot to be unlearnt and relearnt, so that the order of things is put correctly. It's, you know, it's not just about decolonizing the curriculum. If we're not writing the curriculum, assessing the curriculum, or leading the schools and governing the schools and recruiting, etc., we're nowhere to be seen sufficiently in the governing bodies. We're nowhere hardly ever to be seen as leaders of schools, despite the demographics that we're talking about. And this is in the context of a new world order where, as I said, peoples of colour are the majority on the planet. That's the fact. You know, we've got this in our head that somehow we're a small group and we can. We're here. So for me, I think the demand has to be, one of the things that COVID has done with all the school closure is that, we went back into the home. And in fact, the home and the parents are the number one teachers of the children. We are the first. So therefore, we should actually use this time to take back some of the character and education and the values for our children. And I'm talking about, even if you haven't got children, you've got nieces and nephews or little brothers and sisters or whatever, you know, we have to make sure that they learn these lessons. There's been a whole period where, you know, I was around in the 80s and end of 70s where we fought for anti-racist curriculum, writing curriculum. All that's been thrown out the window because people say we're post-multicultural, we don't need anti-race, and this is why we are where we are. You know, because suddenly people, oh, you know, it's just slavery. No, it's not just slavery. There's so much more that we are and we can be. So I think educational investment is key. And I think there will be more demands now for Black schools, Black-led schools, because we have been fighting for 40 years for the British school system to take into account of our needs and our children's needs and to make sure that they can thrive and survive. And it hasn't happened. So I think that may well be the next step.
Brilliant, thank you, Patricia. Next, we'll go to Nims. What do you hope happens next?
I want to remind us, 3 weeks ago, most of us all over the world watched a man who was murdered on the streets of the United States. And we were locked at home to see the death of George Floyd. Now, different sectors within the Black community have picked up on this moment, but it's not just the Black community. I have been on several of those protests here in the United Kingdom, and I've seen Black, whites, and people from all communities coming together. It's not a Black movement. It's a movement of people that feel there's been an injustice, and it cannot be, it should not be condoned. So my hope, my aspiration, my dream is that the moment doesn't just ebb away, but that we recognize that there are things that need to still be dealt with. People are asking very difficult questions. I had to take a very difficult position in which I, in my role, in my previous role as deputy lieutenant, I noticed there was something that was on the greatest award that the Queen would normally give, the KCMG medal, which the Order of St. Michael and St. George, in which you have Angel Michael putting his foot on Satan, and Satan happens to be a black man, and Angel Michael is a white man. And that's the greatest order, the order given to diplomats. And I was able to reach out to the Lord Lieutenant for Greater London, and I realized that as a result of this, he said I should say this, and this is why it's important I say this now, because a petition has been put up online to get that image changed. The Deputy Secretary of the Order, now they want to change things. Something that has been within the establishment. We're talking about systemic racism. When Satan is seen to be a black man, and the greatest order given by this nation is a white St. Michael stepping on the head of a black Satan, then we know there is something that desperately needs to change. Now, that would never have come to the light without the death of George Floyd. So what do I want to see? I want to see that every area in our society that we see, every area in our country that we see any form of racism, we call it out. My children wrote to their, my daughter wrote to her school, expressed her issues around race. The head teacher called her in, and a number of them. And what they've done is they're going to be changing the curriculum around the issues on teaching, because my daughter suggested, let's get books that teach you about race and the African experience. My son expressed the same thing on Instagram. And now the school has called him to come and talk about race issues. So what do I want to see? I agree with Pat. Our young children need to become the voice of the future. But I also think those who protest on our streets, I've been out with them now. Now they're writing their demands, being very clear. They want to see the recommendations, the Lamour review implemented. They want to see things happen, the McGregor review implemented, all those recommendations. It's about time we start saying, when we are asking for a change, we are quick and we are clear. And we say exactly what we need to see happen in this nation.
Brilliant, thank you, Nims. Next we'll go to Tom, and Tom, if I can ask you to be brief, we have a million questions.
I can easily be brief. So for me, what I want to happen next is a momentum to continue. So I think government's currently waiting for all of this to die down. You know, I think it was the Blair government that said if you want to kick something into the long grass, call a review a commission. So for me, the momentum has to continue. The government needs to be held to account that they start actually listening. So there's been an untold number of requests for engagement with the government from several different bodies now in the last few weeks, and it hasn't been happening. So what I want to see next is actual real movement from the government.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom, and we'll go to you, Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be quick as well. I mean, I would say that there's a lot we can do within our community or communities, if you like. I think we can't expect this issue to stay in the news cycle much longer. We can't expect the protests to carry on either indefinitely. So it's going to come down in the end. If we're going to get change, it's the white majority in this country and the people at the top end of that society who've got to change, and we've got to change them. And that means we've got to interact with them, and it means we've got to interact with them in a way that they understand. And doesn't mean we can't be angry at times, but we also got to be reasoned. We've got to be very clear about what we want. And we've got to, all of us, use our influence to do that. And partly that means that, you know, whilst tonight's really worthwhile to have us talking to largely a group of black people, we also need to be out there impressing some white people as well. I mean, that's one of the things we just have to do. like it or not.
I completely agree, Paul. Thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to try and summarize your questions and give them to the panelists. Panelists, if I can ask you to be brief so we can get through as many questions as possible. I'll firstly go back to the very beginning of the conversation with this question around the response of the government to the challenges we're facing. So two attendees have asked quite similar questions around Boris Johnson's views regarding race and therefore the government's enthusiasm or lack thereof to actually affect the kind of change we want to see. So a question for the panel, from what we've heard from the government so far, it seems clear to me that this government doesn't really care about race issues. How can we honestly expect change from them? Anyone feel free to come in on that. Paul?
I think we absolutely can't expect the government to take the lead here. I mean, if you look at what's happened, I mean, Tom put his finger on it in relation to the virus and the way that they've kind of followed things rather than led, and I suspect that'll be the case here. What they do, though, is they react to pressure points, and that can be stimuli like protests, but it can also be, I guess, more intelligent ones as well, in the sense of, I mean, when I say more intelligent, I mean more kind of subtle behind the scenes. But I suspect that the Prime Minister himself isn't particularly racist, but they really only do things that get votes, and so let's not rely on the government. Let's try and do whatever we can to influence people wherever we can.
Perfect. Nims, I know you want to come in on that, but I want you to come in on the next question. So I'm going to ask this question. This one's from John. And for you, Nims, what initiatives are being put in place to help and support the lack of character and identity issues for a lot of young people, especially young Black boys, have in our communities, and how can we bring them together?
Okay, I think that there are so many initiatives that bringing them together is going to be a massive challenge. There needs to be an effective mapping, and I'm sure Patricia would, from the work she's doing, and I suppose the work across schools, we need to think about how we find effective programs that support those who are vulnerable young Black boys. I am a governor of a college of Harringay, Enfield, North East London, and what we try to do is run programs that have been for young people who have been not in education, employment, training, and we've tried to get them back into education. And I think there is something about seeing the opportunity, seeing the good in our young kids, and not allowing the label and the stigma that society has placed on them and people have placed on them. And unfortunately, sometimes they placed upon themselves. We need to start working a bit more holistically. Unfortunately, we have found out sometimes there's this competitive attitude that exists within our community, and one person assumes their project is better than the other. And we've just got to come to a place where we celebrate and strengthen each other in order to support our children and secure their future.
Brilliant, thank you. So we just more of a thought than a question, but so we have a comment, Nims and Patricia, you both cover similar lines of work. Is it possible for you to collaborate and join forces and give us an update? So
yeah.
Thank you for that thought.
Absolutely. We know each other, so we will.
So there's quite a few questions around business. So Khalia and Tom, some of them are directly addressed to you, so I'll try and summarize as much as possible. So to Tom, is the best route, forgive me, I've just lost the question, let's find it again. Okay, I'll come back to that question in a second. We've had a few questions from people who seem to work in HR within corporates or businesses, and who are asking how they, as someone who is from outside of the community, can implement more initiatives within their organizations that support diversity, and how they can actively become anti-racist without taking on unpaid and inexperienced role as the company's D&I officer. So I don't know who wants to come in on that. Hot potato. So I'll read the question again because I think I jumbled it a bit. How can senior managers without expertise on diversity and inclusion influence their company to become actively anti-racist without taking on unpaid and inexperienced roles as the company's D&I officer?
Well,
Paul?
I think often taking on a role as a D&I officer isn't the most effective way anyway. People tend to be much more influential in their day jobs, and it's while you're doing your day job you often get the opportunity to get those points across. So I would encourage people within large organisations to use their networks, use other people's networks to try and find opportunities to be influential, rather than maybe sideline yourself into a role that might not get you anywhere.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. We have two questions, one addressed to Khalia and one to Patricia, around building financial literacy amongst young people. So how do we address the lack of financial literacy within the Black community? What resources currently exist, and how can we ensure that Black people from less affluent backgrounds gain understanding of key financial concepts from a young age? For example, saving, investment, etc. Education is power. Who wants to come in on that? Patricia? Or Khalia?
Okay. If I just, am I speaking? Yeah. If I can and just say, there is already a parliamentary group looking at financial education, as again, there's always been reports saying it needs to be done. And I think the guy who did the money market has got a whole curriculum that's available for young people and financial education. It's just that the schools are not necessarily finding it within the pressure of the exams to take that on board. I think, for instance, as with all curriculum, it's got to be seen as relevant. So, for instance, it must be seen as, you can do it as a family approach. For instance, one of our Erasmus projects is actually looking at practical implementation of better learning of maths, and using sort of a family approach, you know, like when you're cooking, you're decorating your house, looking at how you use maths and money, etc., budgeting for your personal thing for the family, etc. So parents can do something very practical by being, you know, involving their children in money discussions. And I think wealthier parents, they have those discussions from the beginning. They're talking about inheritances and the legacy that's going to be left. Whereas in our poorer communities, we're looking at how, you know, who can help with the bills, but not actually bringing them all involved in a sort of a financial education at a family level. So I think parents have to be more skilled up in terms of wealth and money and investment, and pass those on to the children. There needs to be more pressure on school governing boards and curriculum to include financial education in schools. I mean, Britain, in terms of the international rankings, we come very low down in terms of maths, and even lower down in terms of financial literacy. We're very, very low. I think we're sort of 20th or something in the world. So, and this is why so many of us get into debt and don't understand about APR, and are using our credit cards and don't understand about, you know, percentage loans, and in terms of our student finances and compounding and getting more and more into debt. I mean, that's one of the things that I noticed when I first came back to this country. I'd lived in Germany before, where they use much more cash and they don't get into debt. And I was appalled by the amount of people that were involved in debt and CCJs because they got themselves into debt. So financial literacy is not only just for the Black community, it's for the whole of this country. And it is in the interest of those people who manipulate and use money to keep the rest of the population in the dark, so that people can continue to scam you and make money off you. So it is in your interest to really learn about money and how money works.
Thank you. Khalia, did you want to come in on that?
No, I don't think there's anything I could add. That was amazing. Amazing answer.
Thank you. So a question for the panel. Do you think that the call for removal of statues detracts from some of the far more serious challenges that we are facing? Who wants to come in on that? Tom?
I've had some of this discussion amongst my friendship group, and I think actually the point is that it opens discussion. That's the key thing, right? So it starts the conversation about things that otherwise people wouldn't have thought about or realized in the past. It moves the conversation away from the typical, oh, you said something racist, or that typical binary situation of you're racist or you're not, to have you ever thought about this, and did you even know about this? And I think that's the bit which is quite genius about it, really. And I think some of the conversations would be, oh, do we really need to take down statues? And my response back is that, in any war or in any situation of struggle, once that struggle is over, all the statues have changed. So I think within 3 days of 1776 in the US, all of the British statues were removed and torn down. It's a typical symbol that comes with struggle, and therefore actually I think they should be taken down. That's not eradicating history. So this idea of photoshopping history is a nonsense, because it's something which has happened for all time. You can move these objects into museums, you create the debate, and then you rethink about what are the values and what is society going forward. And I think that's one of the important points about COVID-19. It is this point and in time for reflection about what is it that we want from society going forward, what sort of values do we want to have, what do we really care about. And I think that is a real struggle. So it requires these moments where we rethink, why did that thing exist, why is it there? Let's have that debate about it. Let's have that debate about Bristol and Bath. I only found out about a truly understood Bath and Bristol 5-6 years ago properly. So I think bringing that into consciousness is important. And a friend of mine, he was one who basically punted back to Oxford saying, if you lose any money from the tearing down of roads, I will cover the difference. And I think actually in that situation you do need to meet the typical threats with an equal and opposite threat to turn that threat into what it really is, and then that threat dissipates, right? So I think it is important.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. We're coming near to the end of the session, so I'm going to just read out 2 questions, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists if you want to make a sort of final statement before we close off the event. But 2 of the questions that you may want to answer within your final statement is it possible to strengthen the Black Pound as a Black British collective, or are we more likely to do this from our African and Caribbean countries? And the second question I thought was interesting is, what can be done to persuade wealthy Black footballers and Black millionaires to invest in high potential Black businesses? So I'll leave that up in the air, but if you'd like to close us with a brief statement, I will then kind of round off from a Foundervine perspective. Let's go to Khalia first. Final words.
Sorry, I was just responding to, I was in the Q&A, I was responding to a question. My final words is just, I think it's incredible that in 10 days or so, we've been able to get 100 and almost 200 people into this webinar. And I think that in itself shows how much people are willing to see change. They're committed to seeing change to some degree and want to find out how we can bring this about. And I think for me, it's just about keeping that same energy. So tomorrow, next week, next month, continued on, we have to keep this same energy going forward. We have to continue, as I mentioned, holding people to account. We have to continue working out how can we learn, how can we shape the organizations that we are in, the environments that we're in, to create change and ensure that this isn't just a moment, this is a real watershed time. And this is from June 2020 going forward, we're in a different period where the Black community comes together, is supporting each other, and really and truly is growing stronger.
Brilliant, thank you, Khalia. Next, we'll go to Paul for a brief closing note.
Thanks. Well, I agree with what Khalia just said, and I think one of the challenges for us as a community is that we're probably not really a community, and just because people are broadly the same colour, although even that's not strictly true. They come from lots of different countries originally. Others have been born and brought up here. there's quite a diversity among what we call black people here, and I think that partly explains why we haven't necessarily come together to collaborate effectively so far. Perhaps this is a moment where that will be encouraged. I think that would be a good thing. And I think in answer to the question about why don't richer black people invest in black businesses, they probably do to some degree, but they probably lack intermediaries, and probably white financial advisors go and talk to them instead. So we have to do some of that and create our own intermediaries, which is what I guess we're trying to do at Impact X, but it's not easy because you run into all the same problems that other black people trying to raise money do. So, it's a long journey. This is an important point in time. I think it's a bit of a rallying cry that I hope could bring us closer together, but it also needs to bring us closer together, and I think it is with influential people in the white community of this country too.
Perfect, thank you, Paul. Over to you, Patricia.
I think it's two basic things. As black people, we need to make the money we need to make, and secondly, get the money we deserve. We have helped to build this country, the empire. We paid it in our blood, sweat and tears. And that's what unites all of us from the so-called Commonwealth, where there's nothing common about the wealth whatsoever in it. So I think with the right education and the mindset that sees that we can come together, and we have, our history is replete of resistance, from freeing all our countries, independence, colonialism, coming out of that. We've been in struggle and unified for the last 400 years. So now this is just the last iteration. And in terms of the black economy, I think if we educate ourselves about how much we are worth, how much we are spending, and how we are conscious, in the same way how we're conscious about who we vote for, we're conscious about who and what we spend on. And one of the things that I'd like to say, we had a webinar recently called Show Me the Money, actually looking at the issues that people are having during COVID. And as a result, myself and Vivar Moon, who is the co-founder of Black Sox, and another gentleman called Adrian Breton, we are in service leadership for the next 2 weeks on the 10th and 17th of July. We're holding free webinars where we're looking into getting onto procurement and supply chains for local authorities and government authorities, looking about how you access COVID loans or other loans that are available for charities. These are for small organisations, so with under a turnover of under $250,000. So we're not looking at the medium, the bigger ones, but the ones who are starting out and are keeping going. Because a lot of us talked about start-up funds. What about the keeping going and then the scale up? So that's what we'll be doing on the 10th and 17th of July. And I'll put the, if there's a way that I can actually put those, the bit.ly links on the group. If I put it out there and you make it available, that would be fantastic. So thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Patricia. And we will be sharing links in our follow-up emails, so we'll definitely be sure to include those as well. Tom, if you'd like to close us off briefly.
Yeah, so I think, I think this moment, I think, has been really interesting and inspiring in the sense of, I felt certainly in terms of building my startup that there wasn't a voice around black issues and a support structure. I was never reached out to as a black founder of a business. There was never any sort of sense of groups or anything. I couldn't find them. Whereas there was the emergent sort of sense of a big voice and a narrative around female founders. There was a big emergent voice around LGBTQ, but I was like, where, what's happening to the black voice? Did the black voice dissipate after the big struggle in the 80s and 90s? What happened? And to the point Paul made, all the different groups, people making their ways, it felt like there wasn't a unifying force again. So I think that's what's interesting about this time. And if we can harness that energy and we can harness around issues, again, the same way that the likes of Me Too and Extinction Rebellion and LGBTQ have, I think we can start to pull and punch to the power of the community, because I think the community has punched well below its weight and has campaigned in quite an old-fashioned way for the last 10 years, and consequently has been sort of like pushed to one side, and there's been as little progress, or hasn't been as much of the progress that we've seen with other issues over the last 5 years. So I think now is a big moment to take that energy and momentum forward, and I really hope everybody does get involved and can be, you know, proud about it, and, you know, not shrinking back away from having these conversations again, as Paul said, with everyone else. It's not just about the internal struggle and the internal show of anguish, but it's about actually bringing everyone in to generate real change.
Brilliant, thank you. Over to you, Nims.
I'm thinking of how we cross over, and I think of a zebra crossing. I think the zebra crossing is not going to be just black, it's not going to be just white. It's going to be a partnership of black and white. We're going to need to work together collectively to cross over to the other side. This is a partnership approach. It is not just a black issue. It's an issue that it's impacted on the black community, but I think that we've got to also start within the white community, address issues like unconscious bias. I think that we also need to, within the black community, make sure we don't allow the notion of divide and rule continue to exist in our communities. Let's not allow those notions that have often, you know, some of the elephant in the room sometimes is, oh, Africans and Caribbeans, we don't work together. And because we're African and we're Caribbean, we have different experiences. Our worlds don't often come together, and we also find that conflict sometimes exists, and we need to get beyond that whole tension and start seeing how together we can build we can see ourselves, like Patricia alluded to, we are a global power, we're a global force. Let's start harnessing the opportunity to not just think within the UK, not think within Europe, not just think within the United States, think about the Commonwealth, think about other parts of the world. We are in a technological age, and our children are being raised as global citizens. We are global citizens. Let's see how we take advantage of these opportunities that are presented to us. And I think that there's something, we often find that some folks, we have often heard that people hire their own image, but maybe we need to get beyond that and demonstrate that we're not just hiring black people, we can work with black and white, even when we get to the people. Let's set examples. And I think that it's great within Foundervine, even within your own organization, you're demonstrating that. Let's demonstrate, emulate, and should I say present role models that can change the world around us and present hope for our children. So ultimately, I think maybe what I'm saying is for us to build the black economy, the future of the black economy, the future of the black economy can only come about when we stand together, when we work together, when we are united, and we start seeing that in each one of us, there's an amazing potential, and we've got to support each other to birth that potential.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nims. And Paul, have we come to you? My mind's just gone blank. We have. Brilliant. So that's all of the panelists. Thank you so much for participating today, and for all of you who joined us for this session. As I said at the beginning, Foundervine is on a mission to change the face of entrepreneurship. And we have been working within the startup ecosystem to really affect change at the individual level, helping young people become more confident accessing digital skills and entrepreneurship, but to spur a wider conversation around access to opportunity for diverse founders. If you are listening and you are an organization or an individual who's interested in supporting our mission or working with us in any way, our emails are always open. Mine's very simple, it's izzy@foundervine.com. Please do contact us. It's important for me to say that this isn't the end, this isn't a conversation and we all go off and that's it. We want this to be the start of something very, very important for the community, and so we will be synthesizing the learnings that you shared both through the Mentimeter that our panelists have shared in this conversation, and we will absolutely be reaching out following this to see how we can continue to work with you and take this conversation forward. Please do connect with us on social media. You will be added to our newsletter by virtue of joining this conversation. Thank you so much to all of you that have joined. Thank you for the Foundervine team for supporting behind the scenes, and thank you to our panelists for joining us this evening. So that's all from me. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Goodbye.